Camille Grayson stepped into the lecture hall, the weight of the room's scrutiny pressing against her like a physical force. The usual murmurs and sidelong glances from her peers met her as she entered, each whisper and glance a subtle reminder of the doubts they held about her. The air inside was thick with the expectations that hung over her like an invisible cloud, a reminder that the space was not built for someone like her. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack as she moved toward her seat near the front, instinctively seeking a spot where she could keep her focus. Camille had walked into many classrooms where assumptions had already been made about her, assumptions based on her appearance, her background, and the fact that she didn't look like the typical student that often succeeded in this rigorous environment. She had learned to carry that weight with grace, to ignore the whispers and focus on proving herself. But today, something was different. As she sat down and opened her notebook, the usual feeling of having to earn her place seemed more palpable than ever. Yet, there was an unusual energy in the room, a shift she couldn't quite put her finger on. Maybe it was the challenge ahead, or maybe it was the confidence she had built over the years. She had grown accustomed to being underestimated, but today she knew she had something to prove, not just to her professor, Dr. Henshaw, or her classmates, but to herself. Camille knew that this moment was hers to take, and it would be different. She would prove her worth, not through words, but through her actions. Today was her time to shine. Professor Henshaw's voice echoed through the lecture hall as he called Camille Grayson to the front. His tone was deliberately condescending, stretching her name just slightly enough to remind everyone that she was the subject of his scrutiny. "Miss Grayson," he said, a small, barely perceptible smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Let's see what you've got. Come up and solve this for us." Camille's heart raced, but only for a brief moment. She had expected this, expected him to challenge her in a way that felt both academic and deeply personal. It wasn't just about the calculus problem, it was about his unspoken need to prove his intellectual dominance and put her in her place. The stakes felt much higher than they should have. The eyes of her classmates were upon her, many of them watching with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and, for some, quiet amusement. Camille knew this wasn't just a math problem. It was a test of her very worth in the eyes of the room, a test of her ability to prove that she belonged here, just as much as anyone else did.
As she walked to the front of the room, Camille's mind raced through the problem in her head. The equation on the board was a multivariate function, intricate and challenging, designed to trip up any student who wasn't fully prepared. It required not just knowledge of calculus, but precision, intuition, and the kind of deep understanding that could unravel complex concepts with ease. Camille knew this wasn't an impossible task, but it was certainly difficult enough to make an example out of anyone who attempted it. She also knew that Professor Henshaw was watching her every move, waiting for any mistake, any hesitation, anything that would give him the opportunity to dismiss her. The room was thick with an expectation that she would fail. As she took the chalk from his hand, the weight of the moment seemed to grow heavier. She paused for just a second, letting her nerves settle. Camille had always studied under pressure, had always been forced to perform in high-stakes environments. Long nights of intense problem sets, competitions where one mistake could cost her everything. She had been through all of that. This was different, though. This wasn't just about proving she could solve a problem. It was about proving she belonged in this space. It was about taking a stand in a room full of people who didn't think she was capable and showing them, through her work, that they were wrong. The equation on the board was more than a test of her mathematical ability. It was a test of her resilience and her confidence. As she wrote the first steps on the board, Camille couldn't help but hear the whispers behind her. "She's going to mess it up," someone muttered. Another voice, more skeptical, said, "Let's see if she even knows where to start." The doubt in their voices fueled Camille's resolve. She knew she had the ability to solve this problem. The only question was whether they were ready to accept it. She moved with purpose, writing out the equation with precision and confidence. The problem wasn't just about getting the right answer. It was about how she approached it, about her ability to break it down efficiently, to recognize patterns that others might miss. Every step she took was deliberate, not just solving the equation, but rewriting the narrative of what they expected from her. This was her chance to silence the doubt, to show them all that she belonged here, that she was more than capable. This test, academic as it was, felt profoundly personal, and Camille knew this moment would define her in the eyes of everyone watching. Camille Grayson stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, facing the complex calculus problem that lay before her. The weight of the classroom's gaze rested on her, but rather than feeling the pressure, she felt a surge of determination. The equation on the board was intricate, a multivariate function that required both precision and intuition to solve. It was designed to challenge, to expose any weakness in a student's understanding. But Camille wasn't concerned. Numbers had always made sense to her in a way people didn't. She had spent countless hours preparing for moments like this, and now the time had come to show not only that she could solve the problem, but that she could do so with a depth of understanding and efficiency that would make her peers, and, most importantly, Professor Henshaw, take notice. As Camille began to write, the room fell into an almost eerie silence. The usual sounds of shifting papers and tapping pens were replaced by the focused energy of the students, all eyes on her. Camille moved with purpose, her chalk strokes precise, each step of the solution clear and deliberate. She didn't rush, didn't second-guess herself. She knew that in this moment, any sign of hesitation or uncertainty could be interpreted as a weakness. So, she wrote with confidence, each line of the equation flowing effortlessly as she unraveled it, step by step. What set Camille apart was not just her ability to solve the equation, it was the way she approached it. Where others might have followed the traditional, more time-consuming method, Camille saw a shortcut. She quickly identified patterns in the coefficients, factoring out terms early to simplify the problem before even beginning the calculations. Her method was not only faster, it was smarter, showcasing an understanding that went beyond the surface-level mechanics of solving the equation. It was the kind of insight that only someone with a true mastery of the material would possess. As Camille worked through the solution, she noticed the subtle shift in the room. The students, who had once exchanged skeptical glances, were now leaning forward in their seats, watching intently. Some of them were even scribbling notes, realizing that what they were witnessing was more than just a student solving a problem. It was a demonstration of expertise, of someone who understood the deeper concepts that many of them had only begun to grasp. Even Professor Henshaw, whose usual expression was one of controlled indifference, was watching her with increasing intensity. His arms, once crossed in judgment, were now tightly folded, and his gaze was fixed on Camille as she worked. When she reached the final step of the problem, Camille didn't hesitate. She boxed her answer with a fluid motion, placed the chalk back on the ledge, and stepped back. The room remained silent, as if the entire class was holding its breath. It was clear that Camille had not only solved the equation, but had done so in a way that was both efficient and elegant. Her approach was unconventional, but undeniably correct. Professor Henshaw stepped forward, his eyes scanning the work, his expression unreadable. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. An unconventional approach, he said, but correct. It was a quiet admission, but it was enough. Camille had shown not just her technical ability, but a deeper understanding of the material that set her apart. She had solved the problem with a clarity and efficiency that made even the most experienced mathematicians take notice. In that moment, the room shifted. The students who had doubted her before were now looking at her with newfound respect. And for the first time, Professor Henshaw, a man who had built his career on his unshakable authority in the classroom, found himself unable to dismiss her. Camille had proven herself not just as a student, but as someone whose intellect and confidence were undeniable. Camille Grayson's approach to solving the complex calculus problem was not just about getting the correct answer. It was about doing so in a way that was both unconventional and far more efficient than the traditional method most students, including her professor, would have expected. As she moved through the problem, it became clear that Camille wasn't following the prescribed path most students would take. Where others might have used the standard steps, carefully working through each transformation without deviation, Camille saw patterns and shortcuts that allowed her to bypass unnecessary steps. She identified the coefficients and recognized early on that certain terms could be factored out, simplifying the problem long before the usual steps would have allowed. This decision wasn't a guess. It was an intentional and calculated move, one that demonstrated her deep understanding of the material. While the rest of the class expected her to stumble or make a mistake, Camille moved with confidence, solving the problem at a pace that left her peers and even Professor Henshaw in awe. She didn't follow the traditional approach, and yet her result was flawless. This was a critical moment, one where she could have faltered, where the smallest misstep could have been used to dismiss her method as unorthodox and therefore incorrect. But instead of faltering, Camille's confidence and command of the material shone through, proving that her method was not only correct but even optimized. Professor Henshaw, a man who had built his career on a strict adherence to the right way of doing things, was forced to confront the reality that Camille's approach was just as valid, if not more effective, than the traditional one. His usual expression of controlled indifference faltered as he watched her solve the equation with such precision and efficiency. For a moment he was caught off guard, searching for a flaw in her work, but instead he found only correctness and a deeper understanding of the material than he had expected. The students, who had initially doubted Camille's abilities, were now looking at her with newfound respect. They had expected her to adhere to the standard approach, to work through the problem in the way they had all been taught. But Camille had shattered that expectation. She had proven that sometimes there is a better way, a more efficient path to the answer that requires a deeper understanding and a willingness to trust one's instincts. The class had witnessed not just Camille's ability to solve the problem, but her ability to challenge the norms, to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, and prove that innovation was just as important as accuracy.
Professor Henshaw's admission that Camille's approach was correct was more than just a recognition of her ability to solve the problem. It was an acknowledgement that there were different ways to approach a problem, and Camille had found a more efficient one. It was a moment of reckoning for him, as his rigid traditional methods were questioned by the very student he had underestimated. For the first time, Camille had proven that her unconventional method was not only valid but superior in its efficiency, and she had done so with such clarity and confidence that even the most experienced minds in the room had no choice but to recognize it. As Camille Grayson stood at the front of the classroom, chalk in hand, the weight of her peers' skepticism was palpable. Her classmates, who had previously whispered behind her back and exchanged condescending glances, were watching her every move. To them, Camille had always been an outsider, a student who didn't quite fit the mold of someone capable of excelling in such a high-stakes academic environment. The hushed murmurs in the room were laced with doubt, questioning whether Camille could rise to the challenge of solving the complex calculus problem that Professor Henshaw had just presented. Even though she had proven herself capable before, this moment felt different, as it was not just about solving an equation. It was about asserting her place in a classroom where her worth had always been questioned. But as Camille began to write on the board, the shift in the atmosphere was immediate. She wasn't simply solving the problem. She was demonstrating an intellectual mastery that went beyond what her classmates had anticipated. While many students struggled with the idea of deviating from the traditional steps, Camille instinctively recognized shortcuts and identified patterns that allowed her to navigate the problem more efficiently. With each line of the equation that she wrote, the room grew quieter, the whispers fading away as her classmates became increasingly captivated by the clarity and precision of her method. What had started as a test of her ability soon turned into a demonstration of something far more profound. Her understanding of calculus was deep and intuitive, and her ability to challenge the traditional way of solving problems was clear. Even Professor Henshaw, a man known for his harsh, unyielding standards, was taken aback by Camille's approach. His usual cold, analytical gaze shifted as he observed her method, his skepticism slowly giving way to reluctant admiration. He had been ready to dismiss her at the slightest mistake, yet Camille was proving him wrong at every turn. Instead of faltering, she continued to solve the equation with unwavering confidence, showcasing a level of expertise that was unmatched. When he attempted to challenge her further with a more complex problem, Camille took it in stride, solving it just as effortlessly. It was in that moment that her peers, and even Professor Henshaw, realized that Camille was not only capable, but exceptional. She had effectively rewritten the narrative of what it meant to belong in this space. What followed was a profound shift in how the students viewed Camille. The doubts that had once clouded their perception of her were replaced with a deep respect. Some students leaned forward, observing her work closely, eager to understand the reasoning behind her efficient approach. They had been so quick to judge her, assuming that she didn't belong, but now they saw her in a new light, one that recognized her intellect and her ability to rise above their expectations. Even those who had doubted her the most were now seeking to learn from her. Camille had not just earned their respect, she had asserted her intellectual authority without seeking their validation. Her ability to remain composed under pressure, to think critically and act decisively, proved that her value wasn't tied to anyone's approval. She wasn't trying to prove something to her classmates or Professor Henshaw. She was simply demonstrating her brilliance for herself and no one else. In that moment, Camille understood something that many of her classmates were just beginning to grasp. Respect is not something that is given. It is something you take, something you earn by being unapologetically confident in your abilities. Her intellectual authority wasn't dependent on the approval of others. It was something she had claimed for herself, and in doing so, she had forced everyone in the room to see her for what she truly was, a brilliant, capable student who deserved her place among them. As Camille Grayson walked out of the lecture hall, the cool afternoon air hit her skin, a sharp contrast to the heavy tension that had filled the room moments before. She had spent years proving herself in spaces that weren't designed for someone like her, places where her presence was questioned before she even had a chance to speak. But today, something had shifted. The problem she had solved wasn't just an academic exercise. It was a defining moment, one that forced not only her classmates, but also Professor Henshaw to acknowledge her brilliance. Camille didn't need their validation. She knew her worth long before the murmurs of respect began to replace the doubts. But now, as she reflected on what had just transpired, she realized that this moment marked a new chapter in her journey, not just in terms of how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. When Camille had first entered the classroom, she had felt the weight of years of judgment and expectation pressed down on her. Her classmates had already made assumptions about her abilities, and Professor Henshaw's challenge felt less like an academic test and more like an opportunity for him to reaffirm his belief that she didn't belong. But as she solved the problem with unwavering confidence, pushing aside the whispers of doubt, Camille realized that she had done more than simply solve an equation. She had shattered the preconceived notions others had about her. For the first time, the room's energy shifted, and she found herself standing at the center of a quiet recognition, not just for her academic prowess, but for her strength in the face of doubt. The students who had once dismissed her now leaned forward, eager to understand how she had approached the problem with such ease and efficiency. Even Professor Henshaw, known for his rigorous standards, had been forced to admit, albeit reluctantly, that Camille's unconventional method had been not only correct, but superior. In the past, Camille would have sought this kind of approval. She would have measured her worth by the recognition others gave her. But today, she realized that her worth had never been in their hands. It was hers to claim, and she had done so, not by seeking their validation, but by proving to herself what she was capable of. As she walked across campus, Camille couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into spaces that were never made for her, fighting for a place at the table, trying to convince others that she belonged. But today, she understood something more important. Respect is earned, not given. Her ability to stand her ground, to remain calm in the face of judgment, and to trust in her own intellectual capacity had earned her the respect of those who had doubted her. It wasn't just the students who had shifted in their perception of her. Camille had shifted as well. She had learned to trust in her own abilities, to recognize that her value wasn't determined by others' opinions of her. She didn't need their approval to know she was capable. The whispers of doubt had turned into murmurs of admiration. But it wasn't their respect that mattered. It was the respect she had earned for herself, the quiet confidence she had built over the years. And as she continued down the campus path, Camille knew that this moment, this realization, was the true victory. Respect wasn't something you waited for. It was something you demanded, something you earned with every action, every challenge you faced. And Camille had earned it, not just from others, but from herself. Camille Grayson's story conveys a profound message about perseverance and self-confidence in asserting one's value. In life, we sometimes face skepticism and unfair judgment from others, especially when we don't fit the mold that society or conventional standards expect. However, the key lesson here is that respect is not something to be asked for. It is something that must be proven through action and consistency. Camille did not need approval from others. Instead, she demonstrated her worth through her intellect and unwavering belief in her abilities.
This message is particularly meaningful for those who have faced struggles in life and may feel like they've been overlooked or left behind. We might not always get immediate recognition from others, but if we keep pushing forward, trusting in our abilities, and never giving up, respect will eventually follow. It's important to remember that we don't need validation from others when we are confident in our own worth. Through consistent action and perseverance, we can prove ourselves and earn the respect that truly matters. Keep striving and trust that your efforts will pay off in the end. If this story resonated with you, please like, share it with those who need it, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.